All right, good morning. So I'm going to be talking to you this morning on the influence of a supervisee's worldview on counseling. We're going to be looking specifically from our lens here at CIU on how a Christian worldview kind of informs our lens, how we work with people, but basically how, because everyone has a worldview, we need to be able to identify what that worldview is because it's part of that attribution issue on our beliefs and values. So let's start with a little quiz here. What do you see? What do you see in this picture? Anybody? A dog? A dog? A boy? Okay, frequently the common answers, this isn't quite Rorschach, but the common answers are a dog or a clown. Okay, people see a dog or a clown. What about this? Right, so frequently it's old lady or young woman. Right, so the old lady, this is her nose, that's her eye, that's her mouth, but the young lady, this is her jaw, and that's her nose. Right, she's turning away. A little bit snobby young lady, turning away. Okay, what about this one? Ocean, you see the beach at twilight, or do you see a rusty car door? It's actually a rusty car door. You don't see that really in South Carolina, but coming from the Northeast, this is what happens to your car within a year. Right. What about this one? Remember this one? Right. Is it white and gold or black and blue? Right, so these are classic kind of optical illusions. I remember this one from my childhood. I can never do this. They always said just like look through the picture, blurry. I can never do that. Supposedly there's like a rocket ship or something on this. I was never able to see it in magic eyes. The reality is that like illusions like this, once we see something, it's hard to unsee it. And if we don't see it correctly, it's hard to change our perspective. So we have distorted lenses frequently that inform our perspectives, but we also can be manipulated. So they say this, that did you know that people are more likely to believe things that are true when they're included with an image, like turtles are deaf? Right, so if you show a picture with it, people are more likely to believe it. And they say that out of context, photos and information are a common source of misinformation. So as long as we associate a picture with it, we then believe that. So when you're presented with an image, people are more likely to claim they've previously seen freshly made up headlines when you include a photograph with it. Photos also increase the number of likes and shares and posts to stimulate social media. And so people are more likely to post their beliefs and believe the post is true if it includes a picture. So the reason that photos are effective, there's a number of reasons. But first is, we've used photos to show proof that something actually happened. Right? Photojournalism, I was here. Look, here I am. Here's my selfie of me here. Proof that it happened. Second, seeing a photograph, you can retrieve information more quickly and it sticks in your memory. So people usually use photography or images as easier retrieval, and that is coded as true. So one of the problems that I've had in teaching is I have a lot of students try to remember their names, but if I misremember their name the first time, I tend to always remember the wrong one. So like I had a student, her name was Caroline, and the first time I met her, I called her Carolyn. And I remembered that I did it wrong, but I didn't remember which one was wrong. Right? I was like, I know. So I was always like really hesitant. I was like, can't you just go by Carol or something? Then I don't have to remember whether it's Caroline or Carolyn. But frequently we do that when we remember the wrong thing, and we continue to remember the wrong thing. But pictures make it easier to remember, and it also makes it easier to imagine an event that happened, which makes us then believe it's true. And so if we see a picture, they did some interesting research to be able to show and convince people that on their 10th birthday, they went up in a hot air balloon, even though it wasn't true. And so within a week, they were able to have someone remember by first showing them the picture that was photo edited and saying like, all right, well, you didn't do this on your birthday, but like if you did, tell me what it would be like. And they had the person describe like what they think it would be like. By the end of the week, they couldn't convince the person that it wasn't true. Right? They would say, no, it's not true, we made it up. And there's like, no, it has to be true. I remember the wind in my hair, I remember being able to see things, because pictures capture our attention. A study in 2015 by Adobe found that posts that include images received more than 3 times Facebook interactions than just posts with texts. So this demonstrates that how what we believe involves more than just our cognitions, our thinking. Right? It incorporates our senses to inform our feelings and beliefs. It's all tied together. And so frequently what happens is when we see a picture, we have some belief that's tied to that, and then we rationalize our cognition afterwards. What is actually informing our understanding is our worldview first, our beliefs and our values. And that's why it's important to recognize worldview, because it's underlying everything else. So how do we define worldview? Well, Sire, in his classic text, Naming the Elephant, he says, a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions, which are assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, which we hold either consciously or subconsciously, consistently or inconsistently about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. In his article on philosophical foundations in clinical supervision, Beaufort says that worldviews have important implications. Right? Sometimes in subtle and other times in profound ways, they shape our understanding of ourselves and of the world. So in the words of Bevan and Kessel, worldviews are like sand at a picnic. They get in everything. This habit of getting into everything, along with the tendency for worldviews to be an almost transparent ground against which we interpret events, is one of the reasons that worldviews underlie much of the conflict among people. The fact that worldviews get into everything like sand at a picnic is a basic reason that we need to explore the implications of a Christian worldview as it applies to our understanding and approaches to supervision and clinical practice. So when we talk about whether something matters or not, when we talk about values, when we talk about issues of connection and relationship, the reality is, there we go. The reality is that we need to help people evaluate and understand what their worldview is as a contributing factor. I think I just lost my image here. So when you think through, you need to be able to identify and recognize what your worldview is. There you go. I'm not sure why it's clicking in and out, Caleb. There we go. All right, don't touch it. No, don't move. All right, I'm popping the HDMI, I'm going to put it back in, Caleb. So the question that we're going to ask is this reality to say, what is your worldview? And people will have a pretty clear understanding and explanation of what they believe. You can tell them they'll have doctrinal statements, right? You look at a church and say, what is your belief? And they'll list their doctrinal statements. But what the research shows is that what we say we believe and what we actually believe are not necessarily the same thing. Am I getting anything, Caleb? I have it on the screen, so I'm not sure why it's not popping up, but I'll just keep going. So the reality is our worldview, as Sire says, is not precisely what we may state it to be. It's what is actualized in our behavior. Because while we think we hold a worldview in our beliefs, as Steve said, we actually live out our worldview in our behaviors. And it's what we do, it's how we behave that is our worldview, not what we think it is. And frequently there's a mismatch between these two pieces. And so commonly I'd ask students, I've taught at a Bible college and now I teach here, and I'd ask them, what do you believe about prayer? Right? Do you believe in your worldview that prayer is effective? And as Christians, I'd say, yes, I believe that prayer is effective. I believe that engagement, interaction with God is significant. And then we have to ask, all right, well, write all of the things that you believe prayer does and why. Right? So you You write these things down and say, like, I believe that the prayer of a righteous man is effective. I believe that we can approach God. And then I say, all right, now that you've written all those things down, flip the paper over and write down how much you actually pray. When something happens, what is your first response? And for most people, their first response is not prayer, which says that their worldview does not align, is not actually their worldview. What their behaviors are is who they are. It's how they act. And so what we need to do in working with people is actually help them identify what their worldviews really are. And if there's a mismatch between what they want their worldviews to be and how they are, we make that adjustment. And we have to change one or the other. We either have to change what you say your worldview is, or we change how you behave. And the reality is, changing how you behave may be easier. And so if you're unaware of what is driving your beliefs, your values, your behaviors, you're going to be controlled by it unconsciously, right? Because that's what's driving your interpretation, your thinking. Thank you so much. This matters for counseling and counselor training because most of the people that we work with will come in and they'll say, well, I don't have a problem with this or I don't have a problem with this because they're unaware of what's actually driving their behavior. It's all filtered through this lens. They're seeing a dog and everyone else is seeing a clown, and they don't understand why the world is that way. And so part of our job is to be able to, as counselors, recognize what our worldview is because, as the Code of Ethics says, we are to not impose our worldview on others. We often forget or ignore the first part of that standard, which says, in order to avoid imposing our worldview on others, we need to understand what our worldview is. And so an ethical consideration that we must have as counselors, as supervisors, is to recognize what do we believe. There's nothing wrong in being able to understand and state your beliefs. The problem is when you are unaware of those beliefs, and because of that, you impose those beliefs on others. And so a critical role in graduate counselor education is helping people identify what beliefs do you hold, and how are those beliefs informing how you're viewing the world and how you're viewing behaviors and how you're then engaging with behaviors. I've written a couple articles on this in the argument that faith-based graduate programs actually are better prepared to establish clinical training in counselors because we actually talk about and address spiritual and faith formation. In secular programs, they tend not to touch faith or spirituality because they don't want to impose beliefs. But actually in doing that, they don't prepare their counselors to have those discussions. The majority of people that come into counseling want to talk about some aspect of belief, value, or faith. And so the goal in counseling is not to only have the counselor's view of belief, faith, and spirituality, but we need to be able to identify what that is so that you can separate out those differences when you're working with clients. If you don't know how to talk about it, you're going to end up imposing it. And so the very attempt to not impose beliefs in the graduate training program actually does the reverse when you don't talk about it. Because as we know in most of counseling, anything that goes unsaid, anything that goes unacknowledged is actually what's driving what we're dealing with. And so we want to be able to identify what this is. Sire provides these few components of a worldview. And he says, these are broken into 7 questions. The first 4 are ontological. The question 5 is epistemological. Question 6 is ethical. And question 7 is ontological again. Don't worry too much about that. That's more the philosophy of it. But as we think through these questions for ourselves, and as we work with our counselors, supervisees, and clients, whether we ask these directly or not, this helps identify what is driving your view of the world, the assumptions that you have about reality. And it's these things. So what is prime reality? What is really real? And how do we know that that's really real? All right, do we go back to Descartes and say, I think, therefore I am, and that's how we know that it's real? Well, what if there's misattributions going on? Do we not then exist? The second one is, what is the nature of external reality? What is the world around us? How we answer and understand these questions defines what our real worldview is and how we behave, as opposed to what our theological explanation might be. And so one of the challenges, even in this past 2 years that we've had as Christian counselors, could be, while you might believe this to be true, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, this idea of safety, but we'd say, all right, well, God is sovereign and that death is going to occur no matter what, and yet we still are afraid of it. We still stay back from it, and that fear then drives our behavior. Instead of the knowledge and trust and saying, like Siggy said, and what about Bob? We're all going to die, right? We're all going to die, right? No one yet, well, 3 people, Jesus Christ, resurrected, right? And then we don't really know what happened to Elijah. He was taken up in a chariot. And then Enoch, he was taken away too. But other than that, everyone else in all of human history has died. And so we might try to avoid that. We might try to stay away from it, but it's going to happen. What is a human being? Right? Who are we? What are we? What does this mean? What happens to a person at death? And why is it possible to know anything at all? How do we know what is right and wrong, and what is the meaning of human history? The reason some of these questions are important is because even though why is it possible to know anything at all, a naturalist would have a completely different explanation than a Bible-believing Christian on how do we know anything. If it's just the progression of evolutionary concepts in soup in our brain, how can we trust anything that our brain produces then? Unless there's a created purpose behind our understanding. So the reason we explore this, the reason we frame this for Worldview, is because it connects to what we do in mental health. So we'll see this distinction, but applying our Worldview beliefs and behaviors to counseling is important because what you believe and how you live based on that belief is your worldview. So counseling emphasizes health, wellness, prevention, lifespan development, and empowerment over pathology. It's not a medical model, right? Mental health, counseling is this adolescent in the field of social science, where we're still trying to figure out who we are in our identity, which is why our licensure stuff is so messed up. Other fields, we have parents and grandparents in psychology and social work, but we're just kind of the new guy, and so we're trying to define what we are. But one of the ways that I explain to my students, the reason when people assume that you're a social worker or assume that you're a psychologist, the distinction is some of this emphasis and aspect on wellness and prevention, lifespan development, and empowerment. That's what we want to do, encouragement of it. And so good mental health will leave a person open to many alternative ways of behaving. And so as we focus on mental health, that's an aspect of our worldview. Right? The DSM explains a mental disorder this way. It says a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stress or a loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behavior and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual as described above. It's a very kind of hands-off, attempting to be non-judgmental. It doesn't really provide any definitive or authoritative standards. It's really subjective. And it, in and of itself, it represents a worldview. The reality is, like sand at a picnic, you cannot present anything about anything without having a worldview. Right? Everything is filtered through a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. Counseling in and of itself is laden with values. It has to be because we're working with people, and people have worldviews. And so what tends to happen that we see kind of in the DSM, we see in a lot of work, is in an attempt to not impose values or worldviews, we end up imposing values and worldviews. And so if you can't define what comes before your statement as a value statement or a belief, then that in and of itself is going to be a judgment, right? So part of this question is the goal in a lot of treatment is not actually health, it's just the removal of pathology. And the removal of pathology isn't going to make people well. It's just going to make them not sick. And that's an insufficient goal, right? For most of counseling, it's an insufficient goal. When I work with my students in writing treatment plans, if their goal is just the absence of things, so to not be anxious, to not be sad, that's not a goal, right? Because what happens is, if this is sadness over here, and my goal is to not be sad, and I'm just walking backwards away from sadness, all I'm looking at and all I'm thinking about is that sadness still. It doesn't get me anywhere. I can end up anywhere. I can bump into anything else because my focus is still on the thing I'm trying not to do instead of on the focus on the thing I'm supposed to do. And our focus determines our direction. Where we're looking is where we're going to go. So as I work with adolescents or or adult males in pornography addiction, if their only goal is to not look at pornography, they're not going to be successful because all they're thinking about all the time is pornography. Just don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. That doesn't work. Instead, you have to turn 180 degrees. That's what repentance means, turning 180 degrees and move in the other direction. So all of our goals need to be saying, what do I not want to do? Or what's the exact opposite of that? How do I change my behavior in that other way? And those are all value-laden discussions, value-laden issues. And so when we talk about treatment then, treatment seems straightforward, but clinical treatment is surrounded by conflict and confusion. There's differences in approaches, goals, outcomes, lots of failure. It's complicated by a shift to physical ailment model. So a lot of treatment, all we're trying to do is only address the removal of symptoms, which is important to make them feel well, but it's not the removal of symptoms that we want, but we need to define what health and wellness actually is, because that's what we want. And wellness, health and wellness are founded in worldview principles. It's founded in the values that we hold. And we all look at the world through glasses, through lenses that are defined by this. So therapy is a systematic process for helping people overcome their psychological difficulties. Pretty cardboard, right? But the components that are included for all that we do are a client or sufferer seeking relief, right? That's a lens. How we define someone who is a sufferer and how we define relief are worldview factors, right? A trained healer whose expertise is accepted by sufferer and social group. Those are worldview factors. What we in the West would define as a trained healer is going to be very different than what someone in other cultures will define as a trained healer. What we define as expertise will be very different, right? These are worldview factors tied to values, tied to meaning. A series of contacts through which healer tries to produce change in emotions, attitudes, and behavior. These are worldview lenses, right? We'd say series of contacts. If I see my client at the coffee shop and say hi to them, or don't say hi to them, they say hi to me, and I just awkwardly shuffle away. Is that a contact? Well, it is a contact, but that's not this contact. So what we mean by these words are laden with meaning and value tied to our worldview. So some implications of this before we talk specifically about the practice of it. So the implications and examples are the role or influence of our worldview on treatment and counseling is that it informs all of these factors on the right. It informs the means or interventions that we choose to use. It informs our motives and the client's motives for coming. It informs the goals or ends, and then our personal life, both as a counselor under supervision or as the supervisor, that's going to come in as a foundation to this. So Beaufort says, specifically, a Christian worldview will influence the choices about the means, motives, and goals of clinical supervision. Christian beliefs often exist in the background of the supervisory process, subtly affecting what we do and say as supervisors. However, a Christian perspective, specifically for this, you can insert any worldview, but a Christian worldview we can clearly define. A Christian perspective can also become more prominent in supervision when the client, supervisee, or supervisor desires that Christian views be explicitly addressed. So a Christian worldview can affect the personal life of the supervisor and supervisee in terms of the practice of spiritual disciplines, the cultivation of godly attitudes and behaviors, and how we deal with each other or with our clients. So being cognizant of our worldviews may not only give us more insight into the beliefs underpinning our supervisory roles, but will also lead to more effective supervisory relationships. So when we talk about these different questions, clients will come in, and the underlying issues are things like, what is the meaning of life? Like, what is the purpose of life? What am I seeking for? Psychology cannot answer that question. Philosophy and theology answer those questions. Right? I have a brother, I'm the youngest, I have an older brother. He has a dual master's in philosophy from Marquette, and he would argue that he's really the one who should be the counselor in the family because the realm of counseling exists in philosophy because it's the only one well-suited to answer these kind of questions. And I would actually argue with him that, no, actually theology is the only thing suited to answer these questions. Yeah. So existentialism is a worldview. That's the irony of that model for treatment. And it's this question of what is meaning, what is value, but it's based in a humanistic lens, which says it's kind of a self-contained system. And so it is a worldview, and actually The reality is most people today, predominantly in the South, who would claim a Christian worldview actually hold more of an existential humanistic worldview. Is while they believe in a God there, it's really more about me here and what I'm doing in my relationships here. And so that is a worldview, and we identify that and say, well, what is the meaning of life? What are you seeking after? Existentialism is a worldview. It's not a theoretical lens. Humanism is a worldview. It's one of the kind of unique, it's a disjointed component in the history of the theories. And it comes out of the Holocaust. It comes out of World War II, when people held to a more Judeo-Christian worldview that said, people are basically good, man has meaning, and then they look around and say, how can this possibly be? Man can't be good because look what we do to one another. And so the role of our worldview is to kind of go through this funnel, is that we all do this. The worldview provides the lens, the structure for our understanding of what we bring. So from a Christian lens, I would argue that our theology is pretty well defined, but everyone holds to a theology. Right? Everyone has some belief in what is their God or how they understand God. That's what theology is. It's the study of God. And so it doesn't have to be, while we tend to use it in Judeo-Christian language of theology, everyone holds to something like this. And the integration that occurs here is this reality of how our upbringing, our culture, our environment is actually informing our theology as well. So we like to think, especially as Christians, that our theology informs our lens of the world, but actually our lens of the world informs how we read Scripture, how we understand what is true, what is right. And so our job is to identify what that lens is and work to remove its impact or moderate its impact so that we can seek to see, for Christians, Scripture through the lens of the audience in which it was written, and then apply our understanding of it in application. We have to do that first. So all of us, though, even the theories here, something like second wave, first wave, second wave, third wave, even existentialism is assumed to be here, but it greatly informs all of these factors. So without World War II, we wouldn't have had this question of like, well, what is the meaning of anything? Harold Kushner, right, said like, God can't be real because why would he allow this level of suffering? And so from this, we all drive our theory, which isn't just CBT, DBT, REBT. Theory is what is wellness? What is health? And in my explanation to most of my students, while we want them to kind of understand their theoretical lens, what's actually happening, I think, is most of our students are instead seeking to understand their worldview and then pick the theory that best fits with how they view the world already. Right? That's what's happening in theories. They're saying like, all right, which makes the most sense? So Freud, who loved had some weird relationship with his mom. I guess his mom was attractive, same age as his older brothers, didn't know which was his dad, messed up. He viewed everything sexually. Right? Jung, looking at Freud, said, like, there's no way that the issue is that we love our mothers because my mom is fat and ugly. Right? So all of us take our personal experience and it ties into our theory, into our technique, into our lens. And so as we think to do this, we use this lens, we use this filter to understand the world. And so our job as supervisors is to know what is driving our understanding of what the meaning of life is, because that's what's motivating us to actually behave and do what we do. McRae says the spiritual model encompasses more than an emphasis on sin and psychopathology. It includes our notion of identity, how we deal with pride and self-acceptance, how we cope with the demands of everyday life. It has much to do with how we structure our congregations, our communities, the social psychology of religious organizations, and ultimately what gives us hope, meaning, and purpose. Perhaps most telling, decisions about our worldview and lifestyle speak directly to how we might deal with the situational or developmental crises that arise in the course of our lives. So when something happens in life, whether that is attributed as a threat or not, is informed by our worldview. What happens? The reason that a lot of people going through the Holocaust, predominantly Jewish people ended up shifting into agnosticism is because their understanding of God then, like Kushner, was challenged by this understanding of if God is ultimate theodicy, if God is ultimately good and God is ultimately all-powerful, how could he allow this bad thing to happen? What does this look like? So treatment often focuses on the biological etiology and is this integration of values, beliefs, faith, spirituality, whether we acknowledge it or not, because our beliefs are driving what we're doing and why we're doing it. McRae then says, the ways in which we cope with the challenges of everyday living are certainly a function of the repertoire of our coping skills, which can either be strengthened or weakened by how we steward our minds and our bodies. So this is the practice of counseling. It's value-laden, it's worldview informed, everything that we do. And so to be ethical means that we have to identify, all right, well, what is my understanding of these things and how is it informed? Where does it come from? If I don't like the alignment between my behaviors of what I actually do and its misalignment with what I say I believe, which one am I going to change? All right, so let me give you an example when we think through worldview differences. This is one of my favorite comics. It's called Strange Planet. Okay, so they're pulling up to the steer close window for sustenance time. He says, whisper your choices to me so I can tell them, so I can yell them. Say, hello, we do not trust you. Please give us the currency first. He says, fair, right? We will inspect this sack as we also do not trust you. Fair. I feel suboptimal, perhaps due to the speed with which I consume that sustenance, or the speed with which they prepared the sustenance. That's why we do not ingest it every day. True. Only special days. Yes, I love these days. What's happening here? They went to a fast food drive-through, got food, and feel sick. Everyday occurrence. The reason I like Strange Planet is he frames it as if it's completely novel, right? Using different terms and frames. And so if you read this and you've never experienced fast food, you're like, what are they doing? Like, what is going on? Here's another example. I do not want to perish today, but to be briefly convinced we will. Death feels imminent. This seems genuinely unwise. We are truly fragile mortals. We did not die, but the moments of uncertainty were my favorite. Right? Observe images of our emotional expressions, humorous dread. It appears you're screaming. I yelled, make it cease, to no avail. Clearly, your fear of perishing was peaking in this moment. True, but I always fear perishing a small amount. Yes, you mentioned it quite frequently. Right? This is attribution error. This is perceived threat. And the reality is, like Steve was saying earlier, and we'll talk later, the reality is that even a situation like this, all of us experience the same physiological sensations when going on a roller coaster. Some of us love it, some of us hate it. The problem cannot be the physiological sensation because we all experience the same thing. It's our interpretation of that body sensation and often our sense of control over that situation, right? And think through the informing pieces of that. So if you're relaxed on the roller coaster, you're in regulation state and your cortisol won't be pumping, even though you're excited and your heart is pumping. If you're rigid and tight, holding on, cortisol will be pumping because you're in a fight-flight state, right? You're rigid, you're tense. If you're regulated and excited, right, you're in parasympathetic versus sympathetic. So even an experience like this, but this is a worldview example. Strange Planet views the world differently than we do. They're coming at it from another lens. And we'll work with clients that what we say in counseling will seem like this to them. It's like, what are you talking about? Some of you maybe sometimes when Steve talks, like, this is me. It's like, why don't you just say you went through the drive-thru? I don't understand what's going on. So as we noted at the beginning, we all view the world differently. Sometimes we see clowns, sometimes we see dogs. Sometimes we see, if you need, you're going to need a break if you saw that rusty car door as like a beach sunset. Like it's time probably to take a sabbatical when you see that. So in supervision, part of our role is to help, the goal is to help and increase our supervisees, to increase our clients' perception of self. So the Johari window here, it's used to enhance the individual's perception on others. And it's used with two basic ideas, that trust can be acquired by revealing information about you to others and learning yourselves from their feedback. So one of the things that happens is we don't know what we don't know, right? And frequently it's what we don't know that drives our behaviors. And so it's the things here and here that often are what's bringing clients in, and the things that their spouses, that's here. Right? So people are coming in, and I have a lot of clients, I work with adolescent males frequently, and the most common response when I'm sitting with an adolescent male and they do some boneheaded thing, say, why did you do that? Right? Why did you think that vaping THC at school was a good idea? Right? What's the response that they give? Oh, I don't know. And the reality is, they don't. Right? Their prefrontal cortex was not functioning. Right? The control panel from inside out, they were out to lunch. I don't know what was happening, but no one was there. They were not paying attention. And until that prefrontal cortex comes online and allows us to understand what our consequential thinking is, to be able to process through, the blind self and the unknown self are pretty big. But all of these, our worldview still is in these areas. And so when we meet somebody for the first time, we make assumptions about them. Right? We see them. I'm wearing the stereotypical professor garb with my bow tie. Right? It's peer pressure up on the second floor of the Schuster building. It's like all the theology guys are like, we should all wear bow ties. So I was like, oh. And when I don't wear it, if I just wear a regular tie, Brian Galt gives me this like sideways look. He's like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you wearing a bow tie? It's like, all right, so I give in. I guess if this is the only peer pressure I give into, I think it's okay. We're not going out partying on the weekends. We're just wearing bow ties during the week. But that's what us nerds do for fun. But when we think through, like, what am I perceiving about people, we look at somebody and we make these snap judgments. And frequently, that's based on our worldview assumptions, what we've been trained to do. And similar to what Steve said earlier, those are often survival mechanisms. Right? But what the trauma research shows repeatedly is that our brain was designed for an environment that we're not in anymore. This culture that we're in doesn't need this. We're not being attacked by lions, tigers, and bears anymore. Oh my. We just live in this world of bad drivers and offensive news shows. Yeah. Yeah, and pork. Yeah, and pork. I mean, I grew up in Jersey, so I mean, to say that the driving is bad down here is really to say something. But it is. So when we think through this, part of us, our goal in counseling is to expand the open self. And our goal in supervision is to expand the open self. To see how can we know more about you and less about what you don't know? How can we decrease the unknown, but also increase your awareness of the fact of the unknown? Right? So as I've continued through schooling, the fearful spot of continued schooling is that the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. Right? So we say, like, as a counselor, you sit with your supervisees. Most of our students going into internship feel less prepared than the college freshmen exiting Intro to Psychology. Right? College freshmen exiting Intro to Psychology, they know everything you need to know about anything that you need to know. Right? They're ready to go. They know about 2-point sensitivity. They know about why there's problems. And then you go into abnormal psych, and really you have your full tool belt. As you learn more, you realize, wow, it's not that simple. Like, what do we do with all of the gray in the middle? That's what supervision is. Right? So how do we as supervisors address worldview? The other framework of worldview is culture. Right? So worldview is the combination of our social structure, our upbringing, our theology, our answer to those 7 presuppositions, and it's informed by an aspect of our culture. And so in culture, Hook, Davis, Owen, and de Blair say in their book Cultural Humility, they say that culture involves the ways in which we think, feel, behave, and interact with others. Culture provides us with a lens or a point of view with which we see the world. Culture affects almost all of our decisions, where we choose to live, what we do for a living, who or whether we decide to marry, and whether we believe in God or a higher power. This is a framework for culture. So culture is the end result, really, of our worldview. It's things that we can see around us, but we might not be able to identify what those motivating factors are. Right? When I came here, I've lived a whole bunch of different places. I grew up in New Jersey. I lived in Ireland for a while. I've lived in Iowa. I've lived in Boston and Virginia, and now here. And I went to a potluck in my first couple weeks of being here, and they had this like pot of like sludgy green stuff, right? And I'm looking into this pot of sludgy green stuff, and I was like, and people were scooping it out, right? And it reminded me of my grandmother's green bean casserole at Thanksgiving. That was like a necessary component of Thanksgiving, but no one actually ate it except for my grandmother. And so I was like, what is this? It looked like spit out chewing tobacco. Like I wasn't sure what it was. It's like, what is in this pot? And it turned out it was collard greens, right? I'd never had collard greens before. And I didn't know I was like, what is this thing, right? Apparently it's similar to grits, right? I've asked like, what is grits? And they said, well, you know, like if you haven't had real, everyone's like, oh, like if you only had grits at like Cracker Barrel, that's not, like you have to have real grits. We had lots of either salt and butter and sugar. I was like, then you're not eating grits, you're eating salt and butter and sugar. Like, why don't you just skip the medium, put the salt, butter, and sugar on a piece of cardboard and just lick it off? Like, that's the same thing as eating grits, it seems like. But that's culture. Like, the things that I choose to eat are informed by my culture, my upbringing, the things that I value. And so as we think through addressing worldview, this means that as supervisors, part of our role is to approach the recognition of our supervisees' blindness, what they don't know, with our own humility. And to train our supervisees to approach their clients with humility. Because when you don't know something, you tend to be more solid in your argument. Right? They've shown this repeatedly, is that the less you know about something, the louder you seem to argue for it. Right? That's just how it seems to work for whatever reason. So when we think through culture as a broader term reflects the fact that people belong to and identify with different cultural groups, and this sense of belonging to different cultural groups influences all aspects of your life. So our worldview flows from this aspect of culture. So when we think through cultural humility, we'd say that cultural humility involves an awareness of your own limitations and an understanding of a client's cultural background and experience. Cultural humility also involves an interpersonal stance that's other-oriented, rather than self-focused in regard to the cultural background and experience of the client. So historically in counseling, we've taught cultural competence. And competence ends up creating stereotypes, biases. And while I would argue actually that stereotypes initially serve some valuable purposes because there's just too much information to take in. And so we automatically operate off of schemas. So as we see people, we use the schemas that we have established to categorize and understand people. But our stance and cultural humility is saying that my initial schemas, I'm willing to make adjustments to them because my perceptions are filtered through my learning and understanding and value system. And so I know that I am viewing things through a worldview lens that may not be the same as your understanding and worldview lens. And so the reason you're doing something, your motives for life, your understanding of values, your issue of suffering is going to be different than mine because you're framing and looking through a different lens. I had a really hard time when I used to work in New England doing Children's ACT. It was assertive community treatment. It was intensive in-home work for children that either had just been released from psychiatric hospital or in danger of going to a psychiatric hospital. It was intensive work. And I would do that during the day. I saw a lot of different clients. And then in the evenings, I would do Christian counseling at an agency actually right next door. I could see it from my office window. And I would go there and work with either couples in marriage counseling or work with adolescents in Christian counseling. And I initially had this really hard shift where I would go from, I had one day where I went to a client's house, and as I'm pulling to go to the house, I see my client dangling out the second-story window, like to here, about to drop. And I'm making this, it's like, should I just pretend like I didn't see that and keep going? Like, what should I do? So I pulled in, and I'm trying to get him in, trying to keep him safe. It was the same house the first time I showed up. He was like 5-year-old kid, had a butcher knife. He was holding it at his mom, kind of chasing, and the 2-year-old opened the door for me. And I kind of walk in, my first day on the job, and I was like, all right, where's the counselor to deal with this, right? And it was me. That level of stuff all the time. I really liked it because you saw rapid change. Right? If you're able to keep them out of the hospital, you were successful. And so if you're able to keep them from dropping out of the window, you are successful. That's what I did during the day. There's significant trauma, significant issues going on. In the evenings, then, I'd have a client. In this particular day, I had this client show up, like 12 years old, and he said, I'm just really depressed. I was like, okay, what is contributing to that mood? He says, well, my friends all got the newest iPhone, and my parents won't get it for me. And I had this really difficult time of saying, so what? Why is that a problem? Here, you should drive with me today and go see these people that have real problems. What is wrong with you? I had this massive shift in what matters and what values are. And it's because of this. It's because my worldview lens had been adjusted to work with clients who had a certain level of need and experience. And then for other people, it's that's not, come back when you're actually dealing with something. But for that person, that was significant for them, right? And we have to maybe address some attribution errors, things like that. But my humility to say, all right, well, teach me about what you're experiencing. Help me understand the world through your lens is what's necessary to work with the range of clients. So how do we apply this understanding of humility through this? So one of the things that we do in counseling that we've shown, in the same way that I taught my children to wave, to say hello, to have good manners, to eat over the table, I have to model it myself. Right? The research consistently shows that it doesn't really matter what we say, it matters what we do. Right? Our children, people around us, will model what we do and not what we say, which can be irritating at times. Right? I remember my niece, they did really well raising my niece, but one slip from my brother, we are the uncles, we can do all the stuff. My brother and I taught my other brother's daughter how to spit well, you had to really get distance on it. And then my brother accidentally said stupid one time. And that was like a 3-year-old kid saying stupid, and we would just lose it, right? It was so funny. Her little squeaky voice, she would say stupid. Well, she wasn't allowed to say that in her house. And so, but because we did it and because we laughed to reinforce it, that was the behavior that was modeled. Well, in supervision, in counseling, the things that we do as supervisors will be the things that our supervisees then follow. And so we need to embrace that and make sure that we're modeling the appropriate things. And the same with clients. It's called parallel process, right? It's isomorphism. It's this idea that the things that happen in the counseling session between the client and the counselor then often happen in supervision between the supervisee and the supervisor. We know it's happening. We might as well take advantage of it. Okay, so what this means then for humility is we need to be able to get comfortable with acknowledging our own limitations, with owning them and viewing them as opportunities to grow and connect with our clients and supervisees at a deeper level. So becoming a better therapist isn't an end in itself. It's not something that can be achieved through striving, but it's a continued process of growth in humility, openness, interest, and flexibility. That's what we're trying to do. And so every point that you're shooting for and hoping to arrive at is actually a new point to recognize that I have more to learn, more to grow. And so when we look at cultural self-awareness, it has these 4 components that they identified. Right? It's the knowledge structures, so knowledge of your cultural identity, which is an important aspect of understanding what your worldview is, what informs what I believe. Motivational processes. How do we learn? What is the process of learning? Relational experiences, how our cultural identity intersects with others, the socio-political systems of power, privilege, and equity. It's things like when we say, I don't understand why that person can't just do this thing. I don't have a problem with that. There's no issue with that. Well, I drive a standard transmission. I have a 5-speed stick shift car because I prior to Columbia traffic, I liked driving. My daughter, who's about to get her permit, was like, I bet you $5 I can start your car. I was like, sure. Because she'd watched my wife drive all the time. And so she got in my car, and she put her foot on the brake and turned the key, and nothing happened. Right? Because she's missing an important piece of information, that my car is different from just about every other car on the road. You have to depress the clutch while turning the key to get the car to start. And so for that, she had to have experience in this that she didn't have otherwise. And until she realized that she didn't know something that she thought was normal, it expanded her understanding. And so that's true for power and privilege too. I'd say like, well, what's wrong with you? Every time I get in the car, it starts without a problem. Why can't you start the car? Well, I was trained to drive this type of car. And so there's a gap between what I know to do and what she knows to do. Right? It's a difference there. And then the last one is meta and epistemic cognition. So this is your reflexive capacity. What do you know that you don't know? And so as supervisors, we're working with our supervisees because we want to develop them not just into not bad counselors. Right? Again, we don't want to just create counselors that don't create ethical breaches and don't sleep with their clients, right? That's insufficient. We want excellent counselors. The problem is defining excellent counselor is a value-laden concept. It's couched in worldview language. And so here at CIU, we use the language of character and virtue. So we don't want just counselors. We want counselors that are virtuous. We want spiritually informed, excellent clinical counselors. Right? We want all of those things together. And so one of the models that we've used is a virtue framework. So Dr. Nana and I actually presented on this last week at CAPS. And the recognition is that to create a counselor of character is to create someone who's aware of what they believe and is acting in alignment with that belief, right? So that they don't impose that belief on others. And we would argue if we want whatever virtues in counselors, what do we want? Whatever it is, if we want that, it will rest on a formative practice driving or arising from a value system. So if we want a counselor who's a good listener, that means that we value listening in relationship. If we want a counselor who respects other people's beliefs and values, that means we need to be able to identify what those are. Right? Whatever it is, whatever we want in this slot, we have to form that. And Wilder and Hendricks argued that our character is formed by imitating those to whom we are attached. Right? And we are formed by our strongest attachment in the shared identity of our community. The virtues of tolerance, humility, and patience can only be learned over time. They must be cultivated and sustained by putting our aspirations into practice, because with enough practice, we can begin to form habits, dispositions, and eventually virtues. Right? This is very important because the research, like everyone's heard of like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Has everyone heard of that concept? There's actually the idea of 3 degrees of influence, that we are actually most influenced by the friends of our friends. The people around us form us, even to the point of our weight, our height, our music interests. All of these things are formed by the groups that we're in, the people that we're around, which is why, like Proverbs says, choose your friends wisely. It's very important to choose our friends wisely because they inform who we are and what we do. And so we would argue that there's no such thing as a value-neutral counseling. The sand of our worldview is ingrained with inherent values based on existing faith and belief systems. And so part of our idea is recognizing that identifying one's faith and belief system is necessary and ongoing to foster virtue in supervision, because what we mean by virtue and the habits we seek to form to create counselors of character is both value-laden and worldview determined. Virtue flows from telos flows from values flow from the standards of faith and belief that form our true worldview, which is our lived worldview, not just our acknowledged or professed worldview. Right? All of these things go across here. And so while we say we want people of virtue in our society as counselors, this is what the ethical code says. If we don't identify what our values are based in our faith and belief systems, we won't produce virtue. It's not possible. Right? We have to identify what it is first in order to form it. And so ironically, like the Code of Ethics, will state some aspects of telos and values, but those telos and values are founded in a Judeo-Christian ethic. Like the dignity of the individual only happens if we are created in the image of God. You can't have any dignity if you're an accident. It's like, well, it just happened. It doesn't work that way. So for us, we want integration, holistic supervision that integrates an understanding of who we are and what that does for our heart, our mind, and the soul. A Christian integrative approach considers clinical supervision from a Christian worldview and would incorporate biblical teaching and spiritual practices into the supervision process ethically because we need to identify these aspects before we can produce virtue. If we don't know what we believe, if we don't understand what values inform our client's behavior, we won't make a change. So here's some practice. This practice asks, kind of in self-reflection on our worldview behaviors and actions, what are we modeling, what are we mentoring, what are we doing? We need to align our behaviors with our beliefs, which means we either change our beliefs or we change our behaviors. But before we can change either of those, we have to identify what it is. Same time, anytime we work with a client, we'd say, well, what do you want to change? Until they can identify either what's wrong and we can identify what to change, or they can identify through like the miracle question or something else what they hope to gain, we can't do anything. We're not going anywhere. We're just idling. And so some examples, we have to be able to know where are we going, who are we with, where are we leading others. As supervisors, we're doing this whether we're doing it intentionally or not. We're modeling behaviors, we're modeling practices, we're carrying values and beliefs that if unacknowledged, they're being unconsciously replicated. And so we need to think through some of these different pieces. What do I teach versus what do I practice? Right? So am I doing things that don't align with what I would say someone else should do? Right? One of the most terrifying things as a professor is role-playing. Right? Actually, I hate being the client because I'm not creative. I just can't think of ideas. But you never know what the student is going to say in role-playing. They could go completely off the wall, and then you're like, oh no, like my expertise as a counselor is on the line right here. I don't know how Steve does Friday Night Lights because it just happens all the time. All right, so part of this, a couple examples of, I only have like a minute or two remaining, a couple examples of how our worldview informs what this does. So past 2 years, this idea of comfort and fear, the idea of safety, right? We actually can't be safe. We'll talk about this perceived threat. It's what we are safe. We're 100% safe right now. If you don't think that you're safe, your anterior cingulate cortex is probably malfunctioning. It's a little bit off. Your ACC is not functioning because you are safe, but whether you perceive yourself as safe or not is some of that attribution error, that perceived threat. And so part of this recognition is that we need, our society tells people that they can exist just here and actually fosters and encourages people just to stay in their comfort zone. That's what we've done over the past 2 years, saying just stay in your comfort zone. Anything outside of your comfort zone is scary, so avoid it. The problem with that, as we see in this chart, is that if you don't expand from your comfort zone, you won't learn and you won't grow. You die. Right? It's just like working out. Unfortunately, it takes like 6 weeks to get in shape and like 30 seconds to get out of shape. Right? It's like I just looked at that donut and I gained like 4 pounds. I don't know how that happened. But that's how this is too. If we only stay in our comfort zone shrinks. It gets smaller. Anxiety will fill the space that you give it. And so a growth mindset would argue that we need to push against fear into growth. And our worldview, my worldview would say, suffering, struggle, difficulty are not things to be avoided. They're means by which we grow. And so my worldview is founded in an acknowledgement. We'd like to quote Romans 8:28, which says, God causes all things to work together for good. But we like to define good as like good for me, happy, comfortable, yellow comfort zone. The problem is the context of Romans 8 is good. The word good aligns with the context, which says we want to be conformed to the image of Christ, who suffered and died on our behalf. So the more we look like Jesus Christ, the more likely we are to suffer, to be ostracized by others, and to be killed, because that's what happened to him. But Romans 8 reminds us that being killed, suffering, does not separate us from the love of God. So even though we experience those things, the solution cannot be that God doesn't love us, because we can anticipate it. Right? So this is a piece of this, recognizing that your worldview is going to inform whether it's okay or not to come outside your comfort zone. But if your worldview says, like, you deserve to be happy, you deserve to be safe, then there's no reason to grow. Okay? Another one is, I don't like the term coping skills. This is just a pet peeve of mine. I don't really have time to unpack it. But Coping we associate with negative things. It's like, how's your marriage? I'm coping. Right? My wife would not be too happy if that's how I described our marriage. And so when we work with clients, if all we're doing and focusing on is coping skills, we're still just looking at the negative. All we're doing is trying to remove the negative. Instead, we want to form new habits, new practices that will inform health and wellness. So a habit are pattern acts that are neither fully willed or completely automatic, which inhabit the hybrid zone known as second nature. As Larry Peacock said, we were talking the other day, he said, Freudian psychoanalysis, his whole goal is to make the unconscious conscious. What we're trying to do now is we're trying to make the conscious unconscious. Right? That's what we're doing in counseling. We're trying to take new habits and make them from having to always think about them and make them healthy habits, to make them unconscious things that we do all the time. And our worldview belief that the absence of pathology or illness is insufficient. We need to pursue health and wellness because we're made in the image of God. We are made to demonstrate God to the world and reflect his love and glory. And so that means that when we experience suffering, difficulty, struggle, that's okay, because it doesn't negate our purpose, our meaning, our values. Okay, more to that, but here's an example of some of the things that I use with clients, because I want to look at the whole person. I don't want to just change their thinking. I don't want to just change the behaviors. I want to incorporate healthy habits. So we see spiritual disciplines here. If I'm working with a non-Christian client, we define, what does this mean for you? How do you connect with what your spiritual self is? Rest, this is one of the critical pieces for all of the symptoms we deal with. Anxiety, depression. If you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not getting restorative sleep, you're going to feel anxious, you're going to have trouble focusing. Right? Water, healthy foods, minimum of 30 minutes a day of exercise. Being outside. My students in Iowa would often be like, how do I stay outside for 30 minutes when it's negative 50 degrees wind chill? It's like, all right, just sit near a well-insulated window. Like, just get some sunlight, vitamin D, some daily insights in doing some of these adaptive RBT skills, self-help forms, things like that, and then regulation, relaxation skills, right? Having things that you can interrupt your sympathetic response to your parasympathetic response. Because what this means is instead of self-care, which we tend to view as, again, as selfish, right? We'd say like, well, I don't have time for self-care. Self-care is like sitting in a bubble bath by myself with candles and wine. I don't know who actually does that, but like if you Google like images for self-care, that's on the first page. We tend to think of it as selfish, and because we view it as selfish, we don't do it. We say it's kind of like if you're running, you'll get dehydrated if you wait to stop at certain points for water. We have to drink consistently. As counselors, as supervisees, we need to incorporate these activities of health into everyday life, into rhythms of life, so that they are habits, so that they function. Okay, so thinking through all these different pieces, my take home for you is this recognition that we need to identify what our beliefs and worldview, what we hope they would be, what we want them to be, and then recognize, often through help for others because of Johari's window, how we actually are, and then make a decision on which do we change to improve their alignment with one another. And then as we work with our supervisees, helping point out those things that they don't know in those right two quadrants on the Johari window, and improve the alignment of their worldview, their values, their beliefs, so that they don't impose it onto others, but that they can be more effective in driving their understanding of the world and sitting with a client and not being unprepared. Because if we know what we believe, it doesn't matter if people disagree with us. It doesn't affect us in the same way. We only become defensive when we feel uncertain about our own beliefs. We don't want them to be challenged. And so if we can build counselors that have an understanding of what they believe, they're comfortable and confident to interact with anybody with different beliefs because it won't change what they believe. Okay, so here's some of the, if you're looking for different resources on this is the ones that are cited in here. So I thank you. Any questions on that? I went way over. This always happens to me. I covered in assessment yesterday, we talked about Enneagram type 1 with a wing 2, right? I'm not a huge fan of it, but they say how one of the things that my type always does is we try to cram more into the time than we can do, and this is a regular issue.